It's me again, Mike Head, Ethical Screening, and today I'm talking to Olivia from Schroder. So if you can tell us who you are and what you do, we'll crack on.
Thanks, Mike. So my name is Olivia and I'm from Schroder Investment Solutions, and we offer a range of model portfolios and multi-asset funds to the advisor markets. And my role is to really be that conduit between our portfolio managers who are spending all day, every day building portfolios, deciding on the funds that go into them, and ultimately looking at the strategic asset allocation, and then between our client group. So I like to call it a translator role, where I take the language that portfolio managers speak, translate that into English, and then provide that through to our client group, who ultimately provide it to financial advisors.
Okay. So with, obviously, we've all seen the previous ones of my marvelous interviews. They tended to be on a more of a topic. But with this one, I thought it'd be interesting to talk about sort of what your role is and how that impacts, because we've had lots of people talk about greenwash. Will it ever go away? Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? How do we stop it? And that bit about how you, as an organisation buying funds rather than direct, how you look at that with the host organisations that you're talking to.
I mean, it is always quite an interesting one, because you're taking it a level back when you're investing in funds who are then ultimately investing in companies. So you, to an extent, have to do almost a double view of greenwashing to try and identify who are those managers that are best in class for actually selecting companies that are on the scale of green, because I think that's the first thing we probably have to admit is sustainable investing is not a binary option. There are different shades of green. And so the managers that we want to employ in our portfolios, we have a specific mandate for them, and we really need to suss out how are they implementing that mandate to identify if there is any greenwashing that we're exposed to, but then ultimately to try and identify what are their processes that they follow to try and identify greenwashing within the companies they actually invest in. So there's kind of a dual layer that we end up with when we start looking at it from a funds perspective.
It's interesting because that being in the middle is sort of like being an advisor, in that the advisor's got to find a way of understanding. The advisor can't look holding by holding by holding. Well, probably could be. It might take rather a long time. And you're almost in the same position, because as you're constructing, so the advisor buying a Schroder collective, like an MPS, needs to know that you've done that bit for them in a way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think especially in the space where there's a lot of jargon, it's quite easy to kind of get caught up in all the different terminology that we use, all the different jargon that we use. And I think that's where greenwashing really finds its niche, if you will, because it can hide behind words like green or sustainable. I mean, we've previously met with fund managers who have sustainable in their name, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're tackling ES and G issues. It might mean that they're just looking for businesses that have sustainable cash flow. And that's a completely different meaning to the word sustainable than others might actually attribute to it. So we are definitely in that middle ground. And I think what's important for us to try and get a good understanding of the managers that we select is having a robust and repeatable process, because I think it's when you have that repeatable process that you're then able to compare and contrast fund managers. And that's where you can sometimes see these more obvious nuances, where what does sustainable actually mean? What is the actual defined mandate in that space? So for us, the first level is thinking about ESG integration and understanding where the different areas that you can actually integrate ESG risks into your portfolio construction process. And then we can take it, further into the actual mandates that we're trying to implement.
Do you think there's a point where, if you're only applying single materiality rather than double materiality, the single materiality ones concern me a great deal, because it's absolutely the right thing to do from a risk perspective for the asset manager, but it's not actually addressing the concern of the client, because knowing that it's an incredibly well-run business that makes cigarettes or bombs, which is the classic high-scoring ESG single materiality, is a bit of a fail when it gets to the client turning around to their advisor and saying, that's not quite what I had in mind when you said it was sustainable, because it's got an ESG score.
Well, I think this is where you've got to determine what level of green are you going for. And so the reason why I call it shades of green is because you can get the very darkest of green, which is essentially trying to exclude everything that has a bad label to it. And then you can get progressively lighter, where you're investing potentially in funds that are seeking to find improvers in the ESG space. So companies who are potentially, the monopoly in a certain area, and they're trying to actually change their ways to implement better processes, to think more about ESG and make more of an impact. But then you can also deal with people or fund managers who are selecting leaders in the space, who are really, at the forefront of innovation, at the forefront of implementing technologies that help them to have a better ESG score. So I think when you understand which mandate you want to implement with a portfolio, that's when you can get a broader understanding of which fund managers do you allocate in this space. So if I can give you a live example of our sustainable NPS, these portfolios are designed to be not purely your darkest green portfolio. They are slightly lighter green than that, if you will. And our primary reason around that is about diversification in portfolios. So sustainable investing comes with some style biases. It comes with some asset classes which don't have ESG scores associated to them, or it's potentially very difficult to get those high ESG scores. And so the way we like to think about it is we like to think about these portfolios as having a minimum amount that they'll invest in the most green assets that we can possibly find. And so I think, again, having that mandate clearly defined helps you to assess the different options that are available from a sustainable investing perspective, because you're right, you're not going to invest in the tobacco company that's trying to, improve their governance when ultimately they're still affecting the lives of millions of people.
I think the thing about it's something I've thought for quite a long time, which is there's much too binary approach in a lot of people's minds, which it's either in or out, and the only way we're going to get anywhere good in terms of transition is that there's got to be stuff in the middle as well. That there are people who like the idea of sustainable investing, but they don't want to be too pure about it, and there needs to be that acceptance. The leaders and the improvers thing is kind of interesting as well, because you need both. You need the innovators, but at the same time, the only way we're going to get there in terms of whether it be energy as an obvious example, or some of the other issues that are having a big environmental impact, is by accepting that an oil company that is doing everything it possibly can to minimize its risk and to transition properly, rather than one that's ignoring it, you don't exclude both of them automatically.
Again, it goes back to the mandate. If a client has a specific need to exclude certain sectors, then that comes with potentially unintended consequences, but that also comes with a specific defined mandate, which then that does start limiting the number of investors who are in this space. So I can't remember where I read it, but I read something a while ago that says we just need more people doing a little bit of something, and that's going to create the change, as opposed to a few number of people doing big things. So if more of us can actually access sustainable investing and feel comfortable with what it is that we're investing in, that's why I always bring it back to the mandates. What is the definition of the portfolio that you're investing in? How green is it? Because once you understand that, it then becomes easier to actually invest in something like that, because it's going to align with your values. And that's what's ultimately going to keep you invested and continue to invest in that type of space. So I think the leaders and improvers is, that's how we're going to change the world, but we need more people to feel comfortable in that space and feel comfortable that it's not at the cost of returns. Because I think that's where people also, hit a bit of a stumbling block, is they feel that they then have to give up returns by investing in companies which are, more heavily aligned to ESG.
It's that point's very well made. It's that element of, lots of countries like to use it as an excuse, that sort of, China and India and the US, look at their emissions. We only contribute 1%, so why should we bother? Well, if everyone takes that attitude, then no one's going to bother. And taking a position of saying, actually, I am concerned about this, but I'm a realist. There's lots of people saying the things they want to avoid and then walking out and getting into their motor car, which always strikes me as slightly peculiar. And so, let's find a way that we can get there, because otherwise we're not going to get there by being completely pure. And the idea that we can stop immediately doesn't work either. So that's sort of, there are enough funds there for the very pure. There are some funds there that don't seem to think there's any reason to have any principles, which is kind of interesting. And I think the middle ground is a more fertile one, because that's where the majority of people would say, do you know what, that's a sensible thing to do, rather than it being at the extreme end. And I think advisors would be more comfortable there. I think the clients who are able and willing to apply the strictest criteria are almost already catered for. I think the beginning of the greenwashing coming to people's attention was there was an awful lot of relabeling going on not that many years ago, but a few years ago. That obviously has slowed down in terms of just people thinking, well, I know yesterday it was called the UK Equity Fund, but today it's called the UK ESG Equity Fund, and nothing else has changed apart from the name. Are you seeing a lot of new entries that are getting your attention in a positive way, in that you're thinking, oh, that's innovative, what an interesting idea. Ooh, I wonder if Schroder will ever launch one of those, that type of thing?
Yes, I think for me, in any case, I think the big area is really around the thematic space and how you're getting quite niche funds that are targeting very specific objectives. So if we think about, a global sustainable fund, they could be tackling various areas. Often people try and align to some of the SDGs, which I think makes it tangible as well for, never mind advisors, but for end clients, because that's something you can actually refer to and it's quite easy to look at. But I think the interesting space is targeted funds, which are really looking to solve specific problems. So, for example, it's actually not a Schroders fund that we invest in, but we do invest in a sustainable water fund. And that sustainable water fund is designed to invest across the value chain of water. And where are the areas where we might actually need to increase investment so that we can have sustainable water? I always think, we turn on the shower and we wait for 30 seconds for the water to get hot. That's not something that we often consider. Whereas if we look back to when I was in Cape Town when there was the drought, and you shower with a bucket underneath the water so that you can catch that water to repurpose it for flushing your toilets. It's those kind of things where we almost take it for granted a little bit, but that's going to be something that's critical to actually sustain over the long term, is having a completely sustainable water infrastructure throughout the value chain. And so, Schroders obviously do a good job of this as well with a lot of the funds that they run. I think an interesting one is around food security as well, because that, again, something that we don't necessarily think about on a day-to-day basis. You go to the supermarket and you order whatever it is that you want, because it's all available regardless of the season, because it's being imported from who knows where. So again, those kind of things I think are important for investors to think about.
I must admit, I find that those specific funds, rather than just being a global something fund, they are much more interesting. And you mentioned there about, let's do a little Schroder plug here, because I was at a Schroder event earlier this year that was outstanding.
Glad to hear it.
Well, essentially it was around biodiversity. And going back to the point there I was making about, China, India, the US, and look at all their emissions, we can't make a difference as a country, let alone as individuals, on the to what's happening with the climate, etc. But we can with biodiversity. We can make a huge difference. And although we could as a country, we could make a huge difference by doing something around regenerative agriculture. Let's not kill it rewilding, because that will drive somebody mad at a newspaper we don't necessarily read. And it's a really interesting thing. And I actually saw something a couple of weeks ago. There's an oncology fund, and I just thought, that's specific. At the same time, it's the word that you don't want to hear when you go to see the doctor. Then you just sort of think, okay, and I think it's brilliant, because that focus, rather than trying to just say, well, we're going to buy Vestas Wind and Ørsted and all the rest of it, it's like, yeah, okay, that's fine, but having something specific, as you say, whether it be water or essential things, it's very exciting, I think.
I think what's critical as well from an investing perspective, especially if we want people to invest in sustainable portfolios to drive this change, we need to make sure that people feel comfortable in the space that they're investing, because, like I said, we need more people actually within this space. And so I think at an investing level, we also need to think about how these funds work together. So again, to my point around diversification, if we don't understand all of the risks that are present, even if it is the risks that are kind of unintended, we need to look at how those funds, even when they are quite specific and quite thematic, how do they actually group together with one another, and what is our overall exposure then? Because that's where you're then able to really, tilt into specific styles, make sure you have a balanced portfolio, make sure that there is diversification, that you don't have those unintended consequences. And so I think you've also, once you've selected these specific funds that are targeting specific impacts or outcomes, you then need to zoom up another level and think about what's the overall portfolio construction when we select all of these funds.
Yeah, because otherwise you just get an awful lot of overlap, and people look and they think, well, I might just want to bought 2 funds myself rather than buying an MPS where I've got an added layer of cost. But it looks like everything is essentially sort of a little bit blended.
No, definitely. And I think, again, you've got to assess each of these managers as well and understand how are they implementing these strategies and what types of strategies are they implementing. Is it, again, like I said, is it the leaders, is it the improvers? Which kind of direction are they going? And if I think about that repeatable process that we have, when we're looking at each of these managers, we assess on 2 levels when it comes to ESG. Is the first one is we actually look at a firm level. So we want to understand Schroders as a business. How do you actually score in this space? What are your policies on human rights? What are your policies on your environmental policies? Understanding, is Schroders a good steward of capital? Do their actions meet their words? If you look on their website, what does it actually say? And is that what we're actually seeing in reality? And when you understand that firm level, I think that gives you good insight into how that might filter down into the individual funds that then exist under that specific firm. So our second level of analysis that we do is at a fund strategy level, where we say, okay, the water fund, for example, how does it think about ESG risks? Because if you don't understand what risks exist, if you haven't identified them, you can't mitigate against them. You can't try and plan to find ways around those risks or to accommodate them if they're necessary risks. And so when we think about it at that firm level basis, we're looking at investment philosophy, we're looking at process, we're looking at the people involved, we're looking at the resources that they have. And I think that's a really interesting one, because that's what ties back to the firm level, being a good steward of capital. Because if Schroders as a business is not a good steward of capital, but now I'm trying to sell you our sustainable MPS, but you're hearing things about us in the news that, we're not actually doing this, those 2 messages don't actually align. And for me, that's one of the things that you can actually use to identify potential greenwashing, is consistency throughout that process. Because if there isn't that consistency, that's where people are, again, like I said, potentially hiding bits of information. And for us, we want to understand what is the score of the overall firm as a steward of capital, and then what is the score of the overall fund and its strategy. And does it have the resources? Is it supported at that firm level to actually implement those resources and then ultimately invest in good companies or leading companies or improving companies? Are they able then to engage with those companies? I mean, engagement is a whole other section when it comes to sustainable investing. And I think, that repeatable process, being able to assess those managers at those levels and then compare and contrast them to one another, I think that's really powerful from an analysis perspective.
I think it must be really so frustrating if you are running a small specialist fund with a very committed team within an entity that isn't really looking in anything like the same direction as you, and that it's tricky, isn't it? Because if you are a big manager who has some legacy issues, should you should still be allowed to get into the marketplace, because otherwise that whole idea of improvers. I know at one stage with labels, there was this sense that if you're one of the companies that's got a bad reputation, then you shouldn't be allowed to do it. And I thought, well, that's wrong. And it's that thing about the only way you're going to get this change is if you are an asset manager with a or you're a bank, for example, with a terrible reputation around lending on fossil fuels and the like. Does that mean you can't have a sustainability fund? That seems like nonsense to me.
They definitely have a tougher job, right? Once you've been labeled and put in a box, I mean, this probably goes broader than investing, but it's quite difficult to get out of that box and to then redefine yourself as being a manager who wants to operate in that space. So I think, to an extent, you can give those types of companies the benefit of the doubt. But again, to my point on actions speak louder than words, you really have to see that translate into what's really happening.
As you will have noticed, and anyone watching will notice, these are very unscripted. So you never really know how it's going to turn out. And I'm sitting here after 2 minutes thinking, what are we going to talk about? And then 4 hours later, I'm thinking, I'm going to have to tell her, I think this is over now. But it's also, it's the human face of Schroders. You know, you're a £800 billion company with an enormous office and the like, but there's people work there, same as doing tiny little boutique firms. And there's a lot of views that overlap between both in terms of the commitment of the individuals and the desire to make a difference on something that is as important as this.
Yeah, and there's a lot of very passionate people in this building as well, and I think that's, again, that supports the process of change, because change is not easy, and most of us, you know, push up against it. So when people are passionate about it and you get to meet with the people in this building who are passionate about it, it kind of fuels you with inspiration, right, to make that change. I actually was at the Sustainable Investment Awards I think it was last week. And a few of our funds were up for awards, and we were also actually up for an award on ESG integration, which I will just shamelessly plug there. We did win, which is great.
Yay.
But again, sorry, I know you said I wasn't allowed to sell anything, but I just thought to recognize the achievements where they are, because it is testament to the passionate people that are in this building who want to make that difference. And if I reflect back on being good stewards of capital, you know, we're, like you said, we're all invested in this. And if that's the world that we want to try and build, then we have to be passionate about it, because it's not going to be easy and there's going to be a cost to it. I mean, I think last year was probably one of those moments where investors who were in sustainable portfolios really had to question, why am I in the sustainable portfolio? Because you probably felt quite a bit of pain. Again, like I said, there's a bias in sustainable investing. It tends to be more growth orientated. Last year, value was in favor, so you didn't really see the returns that other people potentially saw. What little returns there were, let's say that. But I think that really questioned people's beliefs and understanding that there's a cost to change. And so sometimes there are going to be these periods of volatility. If it's something that you believe in and it's something that you think is going to have a real impact, then you're more likely to actually stay invested in that type of strategy. And again, you know, this year is a different year, so we're seeing it play out differently.
I think as the final point, there's a fairly big cost to no change. And yes, the financial one will pale. Well, actually, the financial one will be enormous, but the physical will be much, much worse. Lovely to talk to you.
Absolute pleasure.